Welcome and hello. I'm Dan Turner. I'm Head of Programming and Outreach for the Georgetown County Library, and we're great to see you all here today out at the Southern Georgetown Library. We appreciate our host here, our branch manager, Cherie Drayton. She does a wonderful job, and we really, she's done a terrific work in hosting the Justice for All Civil Rights exhibit. So definitely have a look at that if you haven't yet, out in the main area of the library here. It's wonderful, sponsored by the University of South Carolina's Center for the Study of Civil Rights Research and History. And that'll be here through December 15th. And alongside that, we've had some programs, and we'll continue to have programs. Had Steve Williams a couple of weeks ago, and today we have another program with Claudia Smith Brinson. This program today is supported by South Carolina Humanities, a not-for-profit organization inspiring, engaging, and enriching South Carolinians with programs on literature, history, culture, and heritage. South Carolina Humanities receives funding from the National Endowment for Humanities. Democracy Demands Wisdom. And we'll hear a lot of wisdom today from Claudia. We do ask, because this is sponsored by South Carolina Humanities, that you please complete and return an evaluation form that we have. You may have received one already. If you could please do that and hand that in to our friend at the back before you leave. Much appreciated. A little bit about Claudia Smith Brinson. There's a lot about her, so we'll just say a little bit about her because I know you want to get on to the main show here. But she worked as a journalist for more than 30 years in Florida, Greece, and South Carolina. So international journalist. She was a national columnist for the state newspaper, and her reporting at the state won more than 36 state and regional awards. She was named South Carolina Journalist of the Year by the South Carolina Press Association and a South Carolina Woman of Achievement by the South Carolina Commission on Women. For many years, she also taught courses on journalism and writing at the University of South Carolina and at Columbia College, where she held the Harriet Gray Blackwell Endowed Professorship. She is the author of Stories of Struggle, The Clash Over Civil Rights in South Carolina, which came out from the University of South Carolina Press in 2020, and is also available in paperback at the back table there. It's a pioneering account of the long, difficult push for equal rights in South Carolina, from which her talk today is drawn. Over several years, Brinson interviewed more than 150 Black activists for this book. She feared the heroism of these elders would be lost because of their modesty, others' indifference, time's passage, and their deaths. And thus, a false narrative of South Carolina's civil rights journey would remain. So we're grateful she put all that work and time into this. Her second book, Injustice in Focus, The Civil Rights Photography of Cecil Williams, will be published in 2024. All right. So with that, let's welcome in Claudia Smith Brinson. Thank you so much.
So I'm so grateful that you came on such a beautiful day. I know you were probably saying, sitting out in the sunshine, coming inside. So I'm going to tell you very briefly a little about how did I end up doing a book like this, and a little about the book itself. And then I want to spend most of the time talking about the wonderful women of the hospital strike. And I'm going to save some time at the end because I would really love to be having a conversation with you. So I grew up all over the world. My dad was in the Air Force. And I came to South Carolina because, sort of odd little story, my father had never paid taxes state taxes anywhere, which is illegal. So I had, and I was going to be sending myself through college, and I managed to persuade the dean of the law school, because I knew my father had gone into World War II from here, to let me be an in-state student. And that's how I came to South Carolina. Sort of strange, right? And then came back to earn a master's, and I started what I call my baby reporter career after being in Florida. And one of the things that happens to you when you're a military brat is that you're always outside as well as inside. I mean, if you work to be inside, you're going to have friends, your teacher's going to know your name, but you're also outside because you're going from culture to culture. And the United States is full of different cultures, as you know. Texas is different from Virginia. California is different from South Carolina. And I also lived in Greece and Japan. So when I came to South Carolina, although my parents were Southern, I had not really been in the Deep South. And I was immediately puzzled, this would have been the very late 70s, early 80s, at where this place was, where its mindset was. And because I'm old enough to have been a student in segregated schools, but I was not, because I was on military bases that had been desegregated since the late 40s with Harry Truman. And so my school experience was not segregated, and because I was living in a variety of different places, I very early on thought different from me is not the central point, and different is really interesting. And so when I came to South Carolina after being an education reporter briefly, I asked if I could start writing about poverty, because here was South Carolina, 47, 48, 49, 50, on all the things you wouldn't want to be at the bottom on. And there was no writing about it. And as I started writing, I came a lot to the Low Country, and I started meeting wonderful Black elders. And I started asking myself, why can't I find them in the newspaper files? Why don't I know their names? Because they were such stellar human beings who had done such brave things. And I started pushing with my editors to have the space and the time to write about the people that I was meeting. And as you well know, if you think back, if you can think back, you look very young, but if you can think back to those years, the white papers wrote about white people, right? And if there were African Americans in the newspaper, they might be on the front page for something negative, not something positive. And history was told in a certain self-justifying way by people who were still segregationists and white supremacists. So I thought a lot about this, and I thought, how can I, the cliches make a difference, but how can I make a difference with reporting here? And I was winning a lot of awards, so I had a license to ask for things. And I decided I want to write about all the people who aren't in the newspaper. So that is African Americans, that's women, that's children, we can go through the list. That's everybody but the old white guys who were in the paper all the time. So that became my portfolio, and I focused on poverty and then on other issues, but all the time I was trying to meet wonderful Black elders who knew the Constitution backwards and forwards, had pursued the vote for not only themselves but future generations, had pursued desegregation of schools for future generations. And one of the things I learned very quickly was these were people who were not doing things for themselves. Right? They were looking to the future, to their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren, and sacrificing so much in their lives to do that. So out of this, over many years, because I was working full-time, came this book, Stories of Struggle. And it's three main sections. One is Briggs versus Elliott, which was the lawsuit in Clarendon County that became the first lawsuit for Brown versus the Board of Education, which was the lawsuit that declared segregation in public schools unconstitutional. And then the 1960 sit-ins and all the young people that were involved in that, and then the 1969 Charleston hospital strike, which historians label as the last big civil rights movement of the civil rights era, which they sort of marked from the 40s to the 70s. So I'm really happy to be able to talk about the hospital strike because it's about 400 brave women. And it doesn't start in 1969, it starts in the 30s. So there was a cigar factory. Did any of you remember this building in Charleston? It was the American Tobacco Company, and it's now shops and offices, but the building still exists near the waterfront. And the majority of workers were African-American women, and they're literally, by hand rolling cigars. And the factory was segregated. White workers were on certain floors, black workers were on certain floors. The pay was not equal. You could be more easily fired. And so before World War II, the women started pushing for a labor union. But as the war approached, there was a National Labor Relations Board that put a quietus on this. No strikes, no union strikes, it's all for the war effort. But after the war effort, because the women were still interested in pursuing this, they worked for equal pay, they worked for desegregating the building, and they succeeded, although they didn't really get exactly what they wanted. It took 6 months of striking, and they had asked for 25 cents an hour improvement in their wages. They got 8 cents. They did get access to jobs they didn't have access before. But the women of that strike then became the women who pursued the strike at the hospital. So this is 12 names. Mary Moultrie at the top. We're going to talk a lot about her. These women were licensed practical nurses at the Medical College Hospital. It's now 1967, 1968, and during that time period, we've had the 64 Civil Rights Act and the 65 Civil Rights Act. It's now illegal to discriminate in terms of job access, in terms of pay. The federal law says that this is illegal and that there are penalties. The Medical College Hospital gets federal money. And so they have been in trouble since 1965 because they have no black physicians. No black people are allowed into the mental health facility. The joke was that in Charleston, nobody who was black ever went crazy. And the proof was there was nobody in the mental health care. The rooms were assigned in a segregated manner. Black employees the licensed practical nurses were asked to do things that were illegal for their license, like dispense medication. If they said, I can't do that, they could be fired. So they were in that classic rock and a hard place. The minimum wage was not met. Mary Moultrie, who had graduated from high school and gone off to New York City, was making $4 an hour in New York City, came back in 1967 and was making below $1 an hour. Yeah. And of course, these are people who are supporting families on that kind of wage. There was two cafeterias, one for white visitors and white employees, one for white doctors. African-American employees had to eat outside or in the boiler room. Think that. So all this information, there have been complaints about it. HEW, which is Health, Education, and Welfare Department at that time, has been notified of this. Reginald Barrett, who is a black realtor, has made his way onto the HEW committee, and he's pushing for change, but nothing's really happening. So in 1967, 5 nurses, right before Christmas, licensed practical nurses, are told by a new supervisor to do several tasks without getting any information on their patients and being told to do tasks they aren't supposed to do. They say, we can't do those tasks. The supervisor says, I've told you to do them, you'll do them. They say, we can't do them. She says, I'll fire you. They sit down and they say, we can't do them. And so she says, I'm going to dock you for pay or I'm going to fire you. And at that time, you could fire at will. You didn't have to have a reason. You could just say, out of here. And so after sitting there for an hour or two and conversing among themselves, they said, dock us, fire us, we're leaving. Because if they lost their license, they couldn't get a job anywhere else. So M.S. Alston, whose name you will also hear several times, she pulls all the women to her house for breakfast the next morning, and they start talking about how they need to talk to other people about this. And so over more than a year, their conversations, Mary Moultrie hears about this, and Mary's been in trouble over and over again because she asked to have her name used. She says they call her things like monkey grunt, and she has refused to answer to anything but her own name, so she's been written up over and over again. She hears what's happened to these nurses, and she starts talking all around the city about this. What can we do about this? She's very close friends with a man named Bill Saunders, who's running the Low Country newsletter. And one of the things I should say here is almost all the newspapers in South Carolina were owned by white segregationists. Black life was not written about. But Bill Saunders is saying that he's way out there on the left. He calls himself a radical. He wears a jean jacket and an afro. People are like, oh, in South Carolina, you know. And he's writing this newsletter, and he says that he's a man working for change. And he says to Mary, doctors have an organization. Why aren't you asking for an organization? Mary knows Lily Doster. Lily Doster is one of the strikers from the tobacco strike. And so she talks to Lily Doster. Lily Doster puts her in touch with Isaiah Bennett. Isaiah Bennett was involved in the tobacco strike. And they know about a union for hospital workers in New York called 1199. The hospital, they're long, complicated names, but it is the hospital union. And so they put Mary in touch with the people with the hospital union, and so a conversation starts. So to jump ahead a little, Mary is telling everybody what she's doing, and there's starting to be secret meetings at the union for the tobacco folks. And so they asked for a meeting with McCord, who is the president of the hospital at this point in time. He has grown up in South Africa. So you can imagine what his attitude is about black and white people. He's grown up in a culture where you had to have a pass to come into the city to work. And he is absolutely outraged that anyone would question his authority. He refuses to meet with them. They keep gathering. They get the advice of the union. They reach out to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, too. Now, this is a year after the Reverend Martin Luther King has been assassinated. Reverend Ralph Abernathy is trying to pursue Martin Luther King's next stage, which is economics, as well as racial segregation. And he's interested in what Reverend King was pursuing when he was assassinated, which was labor. Remember, he was there for the men who were working as what were then called garbage collectors. And so he sees an opportunity to both stay with the SCLC's goals, but also step out himself. So he's interested. The NAACP is like, oh, unions, no. And so they aren't getting any help from the NAACP. They're not getting any hearing from Mr. McCord. 1199 is sending some representatives down to check things out. And so they get advice from former union people about just say you want to be a union and start collecting dues. So they start collecting dues, $3 from each person. This really impresses the people who come down to check them out. They say they're serious about this. And they've sent Henry Nicholas, who is African American, the leader of the union, Leon Davis is white. And Henry Nicholas has noticed the dues collecting, but also how strong the churches are. And he thinks this is a perfect combination. They've got the fire, and they've got the churches to back them up, which will also be meeting places, that are safe. So he tells 1199, I think we should go south. And they had by this time formed what was called a National Organizing Committee with $350,000 available to start moving south on unions. So the women decide that they are going to meet with McCord whether he wants to or not. And they push and they push and they push. And so a meeting is organized with McCord. He says, I'm going to allow you to appoint certain people to talk to me, and I'm going to send a few more. Can you read this? Can you see it? We are continuing the racist attitude exhibited today by the administrative staff of the Medical College Hospital as a discriminatory act and duly unjustified. We hope that you consider the sack and reinstate the discharged employees immediately. So you know what happened. McCord doesn't show up. They're angry when he doesn't show up. He has brought in people that he thinks will support them, so there's chaos in the meeting. So they go up to his office. He retreats into the back office, locks the door, and they have a party. One of my favorite people along here is Louise Brown, who gets up and dances on the tabletop. She said, everybody's saying, "Go Brown, go Brown." So they stay there until the hospital staff has called the police, chief police named Conroy. He comes in, he says, I will have to arrest you if you don't leave. So they say, fine, okay. They leave. Mary Moultrie, leading the way in, leads the way out and says, I am the union president, call me Madam President. They go back to work, and at 3 p.m., 12 of them who've been identified as leaders get notices that they're fired. Now, actually, this is good because they haven't done anything but try to meet with the president, right? And so the hospital is already in trouble about, federal funds with segregation, which is now illegal. I forgot to mention, President Johnson has also written an executive order about federal funds, saying that anyone who's getting federal funds must abide by the 64-65 Civil Rights Act. So Coretta Scott King comes to town for the early meetings. She suggests they name their union 1199B, and she makes a speech in which she says that 1199, the hospital union, was her husband's favorite union, and there had been a tight relationship there. Leon Davis had given a substantial amount of money to the Montgomery bus boycott. He was friends with Martin Luther King. She is being pushed to step into her dead husband's shoes in some way. And so she comes down to support the women. That's a beautiful photo, isn't it? Yeah. And she is a woman who wants to support other women too. So she has this opportunity to do that. So they go out on strike. The first day, there are 400 people outside the Medical College Hospital by 5 a.m. with signs, and they're asking for equal pay, but what they say over and over again from that moment on is respect and dignity, that they want to be treated as human beings, and they are not being treated in that way, and that this is as important to them as a fair wage. Hey, just minimum wage, would be acceptable. They're like half of that. So at this point in time, South Carolina has the lowest percent of people belonging to unions, just like everything else, right? And so this is a real stretch. And in the 1930s, in the upcountry, around Greenville, Spartanburg, Onypath, Pickens, textile mills workers have tried to form unions and have been shot by governors. Governors have authorized police, patrol, and the KKK to shoot people who are organizing or beat them up. So they know that this is a stretch, but they know that they have a statement to make and that they don't want to live the way they've been forced to live. So what happens is they go out in front of what is called at this point, the Medical College Hospital, in what is called high noon. So at 12 o'clock, they have gone out and made a point that they're going to strike. And then several days later, they have gone in the morning with the picketers. So a judge says that what they're going to have to do is limit picketers to 10. And Mary Moultrie finds this very amusing. She says, okay, just imagine a football field and 10 people. No. So as I said, there are 400 or 500 people out there. So what happens is they just arrest all but 10 people, day after day. All but 10 people are arrested. And Mary says, it becomes a point of honor. I'm going to jail today. Yeah. So, let me go back. But see the child? Okay. See the child? You bring your kids. You bring your kids on the strike. You want them to learn about citizenship rights, school's out, and you bring them with you. And so it's sort of a family affair kind of thing. Because they've got the support of the union, they're getting $15 a week in strikers' pay. They are using the East Bay headquarters that the tobacco union had used. They're getting donated food, donated clothes. If they have an emergency like rent, they have money donated for that. So they're really, briefly, in a better financial situation than they were when they were working full-time for the hospital. Plus, they have each other's respect, right? Yeah, so it's a very different situation. McCord sends out a really offensive cartoon. Imagine the sort of the 1940s drawings where there's the big round head, you know, sort of bubble people. And this is a person with a cigar in his mouth and a big nose, and he's got it's black and white, but probably a blonde babe on his shoulder and money in his hand. And the cartoon says, the union is interested in one thing. They want your money. Mary says, this is so offensive. They won't pay us. The union is supporting us. And that's what McCord says to us. So he regularly does not help himself. He regularly is just a very offensive white supremacist. So Ralph Abernathy in March decides that he's coming to speak. And he comes in and he says it's time for South Carolina to join the 19th century. Get it? And he also, I don't know if anybody remembers this, but there was a comedian named Flip Wilson, right? Sock it to me. He says he's going to sock it to Charleston. He decides that he's going to regularly come back and forth to support them. Andrew Young comes, you know, who later became a UN ambassador, and he stays while Abernathy goes in and out. They bring in Reverend James Orange, who's one of their organizers, to work with kids, because what they have learned is that young people are a powerful addition, and these mothers are bringing their young people anyway, so he comes in to teach nonviolent direct action. The women are studying nonviolent direct action, and they're out there with their picket signs. So here's Reverend Orange, and he organizes people to do what needs to be done in a nonviolent manner. So that's why he's standing here getting people to kneel, because they're going to pray together. And this is how he always dressed. I talked to someone who, as a kid, was part of the Jackson Street Panthers, and his name was Timothy. And so he told me that the Jackson Street Panthers were sort of a street gang, but they were really worried about the way the police were beating the women. And they were. When they would arrest them, they would hit them with batons. They would shove them when they put them in what were called paddy wagons then. And so the Jackson Street Panthers volunteer to protect the women. And what that means for them is if a policeman's coming at one of the women picketers, they step in front and take the blow. And so they work with Reverend Orange on nonviolent direct action. Now think about this. Here's a street gang who's going to give up how they have been dealing with stress and violence and do something different. And he said that Reverend Orange explained to them that they were going to be the wrecking crew, but the wrecking crew for the SCLC is to challenge a city economically, not with violence. And that when the police are using violence and everybody else is not, that's a powerful message. And so he takes a lot of these young people to the Penn Center to work with them, training them. And so what the things the city does was it starts deliberately arresting the young people, and we're going from March to April to May. It's becoming hot, South Carolina. They pin them up outside without water, but the kids keep coming back. So as this continues, Governor McNair, who months before, in 1968, had sent in the National Guard, and young people at South Carolina State and Claflin had been assaulted by the Guard and murdered by the Guard, and the Guard was not punished for this, and the Highway Patrol. The Highway Patrol officers were charged under federal laws, but were not found guilty. He has sent in troops again to Charleston, even though, keep in mind, you saw those pictures, it's women who are walking with picket signs with their children. So where is the federal government at this point in time? Well, they're sort of still talking about, wouldn't you like to abide by the law? But this is what's going on in the streets of Charleston. So these National Guards sometimes have gas masks. They always have rifles with loaded, locked bayonets. In other words, if they told you to move, they've got a sword there in front to get you to move. So obviously, the governor had not learned anything from what had happened at South Carolina State, because he's back doing the same thing here. The Catholic Church, see the priest over here? And here's a child. The Catholic Church was very supportive. There was a Catholic hospital. They agreed the strikers were right and that should be supported, and met the request at that hospital. And several priests often walked, they were all white priests, they often walked with the strikers. At one point, they were locked up in a outdoor area for 5 days and tear gassed. They talked quite a lot afterwards about how bad the food was too, you know, or non-existent. But the Catholic Church pushed other clergy, and so a concerned clergy group did a petition saying, you know, we must address these workers' needs. It was not successful. McCord was outraged. So this is in the strike quarters. You can see that while it's very tense outside, it's still good inside. Coretta Scott King is still coming down to meet with the women. The women are being supported financially, economically, and emotionally. And they're continuing with their strike. And it's months into the strike now. When we get to April, Abernathy is coming more frequently. Mary Moultrie and Rosetta Simmons, who is the leader for the Charleston County Hospital, and their good friend Naomi White have all served time in jail. Mary has gone to talk to McNair, who said to her, you know, Mary, if I worked at JCPenney and conditions weren't the way I liked, I'd just go find a job elsewhere. Which she just said, he has no idea what we're talking about, and he doesn't want to know. However, one of the things that was happening because of all the federal pressure, which he wasn't acknowledging, was the state of South Carolina had no job ladders for state jobs. There were private fiefdoms. You know, if you're talking about the Department of Education, you're talking about the Highway Patrol, any things, there were, my phrase, old white guys who were in charge and had been charged for decades. They were going to be in charge until they had a heart attack at their desk, and who could promote all their relatives and nobody else. And so when Abernathy was joking about getting, you know, South Carolina a century up, McNair actually was paying attention to that, and there was a lot of other pressure to have a pay ladder, a promotions ladder, all these things that was, of course, missing at the medical college, which is taking state money as well as federal money. So that's going on in the background. So Abernathy comes back and is worried about the young people and civil disobedience. And he goes to Columbia to try to meet with McNair himself. He's unsuccessful with that. This is Reverend McKinley Bowman, who was a marvelous entrepreneur. He owned a radio station. He was one of the first African Americans to serve on the Richland County School Board. He had he was very involved with the sit-ins and getting kids out of jail. And so I think you can see here, he's pretty happy to be hanging out with Reverend Abernathy. So Mary Moultrie is arrested April 11th with 170 other people, and with M.S. Alston, who I'd mentioned before, and her friend Naomi White. They're in jail the first time for 11 days. They turned up the heat one day. They're all, all of them are in one large room. They are given a meal one day of butter beans, green peas, and pork and beans. The people supporting them are bringing fried chicken that they never see. You know? So the SCLC staff, there is a division here, and the SCLC staff and the officers of the 1199 are staying at the Holiday Inn. And Mary has moved out from her mother and her daughter to what's called the Brooks Motel, which is a motel for African Americans, because of death threats. So she's at the Brooks Motel. Henry Nicholas, who I remember I said is African American, he's at the Holiday Inn and another inn because he's out on the street a lot and he's worried. One day he's going not to the Holiday Inn, but to the other inn, and as he pulls into the parking lot, the room that he stays in regularly explodes. So a bomb has been planted. He decides he's staying back at the Holiday Inn now. They put some of the Jackson Street Panthers and some SNCC members who are armed start guarding Mary Moultrie. She gets a local guard too named Eva Alston, who carries acid in her pocketbook instead of a pistol. But again, they're mostly nonviolent. And they start guarding everybody. There are guards outside of the Union Hall when people are there eating or organizing. So Coretta Scott King comes in again, and she said, "This is a fight for human rights and human dignity. You in Charleston are demonstrating that my husband's dream still lives." And keep in mind, there's pressure on her to be doing something about that dream. So here she is. This is a march of more than 1,000 people, so I'm gonna get in your way, but then get out of your way. This is Mary Moultrie, Coretta Scott King. This is Rosetta Simmons, who I mentioned was the Charleston County Hospital. Her name just went out of my head, but it'll come back in a minute. She is the vice president of 1199 in New York. And here's Reverend Orange. This is just a newspaper reporter. And so they're marching. They're marching over and over and over again. And they're filling the streets. In 1960 and 1963, there were civil rights actions, one concerned with the sit-ins, and then in 1963, it was a summer of NAACP effort to get some more things done that should have happened in 1960. So Charleston has had the experience of having the streets blocked and the merchants not being able to get customers in downtown. But now we're approaching tourist season, aren't we? Yeah, what's going to happen with all those little carriages with rich people on them? What's going to happen with the restaurants? What's going to happen with those stores who are counting on that money? So this is increasing the pressure. So there's 140 arrests one day. There are 170 another day. Their arrests are now in the hundreds day after day after day. On this march, when Coretta Scott King comes, there are 1,500 people on the street with her. And she says that Charleston is now linked to Memphis and Selma as cities that are making a statement. Reverend Abernathy has been arrested before she comes, and he stays in jail for 8 days. The conference is getting a little worried now because this is very expensive. Excuse me, I said the conference, I was thinking of the NAACP, but they're not there. The union and the SCLC are worried because it's becoming very expensive for them, but also it's very expensive for the state of South Carolina. It ends up being millions of dollars, and I think about, we're talking about the 60s, millions of dollars in lost tourism and business by the end of the strike. So there's another issue here, which is the violence of the law enforcement, which is making everybody very stressed. So this is the social worker wife of Leon Davis, Julia Davis. There's Mary Moultrie, Coretta Scott King, and Rosetta Simmons. And they would stand in front of the Medical College Hospital. And so a few days after this kind of demonstration, without Coretta Scott King there, but with Abernathy there, there's a rush to try and get in the doors of the hospital, and they arrest everybody again. And of course, it's not going to be a successful rush. They know that. They're making a point. Andrew Young says at this point in time, only at the time that you keep the same crisis on the community as exists in the daily life of the worker is a strike going to be settled. So you can see bigger marches, more dramatic nonviolent direct action to push what they want to have happen. So Mother's Day is approaching. There's a Mother's Day march. get ready for this, 15,000 people marching from all over the United States, buses pouring in. Can you imagine that? I'm going to look for this again. I wish I had it for you, but Cecil Williams, the civil rights photographer, lived in Orangeburg, does have a picture. He has a hard time finding his pictures, though, because they were filmed, and now there are all these different systems. But it's like this giant river of people coming down for this march. So here's Rosetta again. This is Walter Reuther with United Auto Workers, so the other big unions are joining in. Here's Ralph Abernathy and his wife Juanita. This is Joseph Lowery and his wife Evelyn. They are founders of the SCLC. This is a ranger from Chicago, and the rangers wore white outfits like that, white hats, red scarves, and rode white horses, and they were a security team from Chicago. Here's another picture I just thought you'd like. There's the ranger. You could see what a mass that is slowly moving down the street. And then, can you see? Here's our celebrity. This is Jesse Jackson. Ralph Abernathy had to leave during the march, and he shows up. Does he not look cool? He looks kind of like a movie star, doesn't he? So he comes in, and he has brought with him not just the Rangers, here's the marchers again, but the Operation Breadbasket Jazz Band. So Cecil said he was like jumping up on cars to get these pictures, and he said it was like Mardi Gras. You know, there's music, there are horses, there are people, you know, beautifully dressed, and there's thousands and thousands of people supporting these women. And why do I keep saying women? There were about 10 men who stayed with the strike who were, say, worked on the boilers or were janitors, but it was almost 100% women. So here's Andrew Young, Elliot Godoff, and Mary. And I teased her about this. You see how much bigger her afro's gotten? And I was like, whoa, Mary, month by month, that afro's growing bigger and bigger. She was involved in the bargaining, but really the key bargainer is always Andrew Young because he's done this before. And I asked her about this, about leadership. And she said, well, she was a recognized leader for the Medical College Hospital. Rosetta Simmons was a recognized leader for the Charleston County Hospital. But they needed the SCLC leadership and the union leadership because these were people who had done this before and they had not. But they were always fully informed on everything, and they weren't ever asked to do anything they didn't want to do. She wrote her own speeches. She had worked with Esau Jenkins, who was leading literacy groups in Charleston, to learn how to speak publicly. She had a beautiful voice. And so she was traveling all over the US to raise funds. She came back with a $25,000 check from one of her talks. She would bring other women to tears, making her speeches. So in April and May and June, there are constant negotiations. The Medical College Hospital trustees do very insulting things, like they meet in a building that's too small for everybody to sit, and they demand that the union representatives go hang out in the restroom. Henry Nicholas says we're supposed to sit on the john rather than negotiate. You know, he was very insulted about that. McNair has said nothing's going to happen. We're never going to recognize a union. And this has consistently been South Carolina's attitude. So what happens, to wrap this up, because I really want to talk to you about this together, all of us. Here's Mary. Here's Naomi White. Oh, I have a story to tell you about Naomi. And there's Rosetta again, is that they do negotiate for union recognition. They do get their jobs back. That had been one of the sticking points that McCord was saying, no, they can never come back. The people who have struck can never come back. HEW said, oh, yes, they will. Everybody at the top levels got involved, including Nixon toward the end. And part of this was there were bankers in South Carolina who were calling because they were worried about the economy. It's always about money, right? They were worried about the economy, and they were calling. So the other part of this is the tension is rising because thousands and thousands of people from all across the United States are coming in, but also they have brought in Hosea Williams, who's one of the key members of the wrecking crew. Abernathy's had a bad stomach one night, and the jail food hasn't suited him. And he's lying on a car, and he hears down the block Hosea Williams saying, white Charleston is crazy. And he gets up and says, I gotta go talk with that guy. I gotta compete with him on what he's saying about white Charleston. And so the way that they're approaching this in a nonviolent way, but a strong way, has made it clear that this is not just gonna disappear. And because the federal government has now saying, okay, we're tired of this. The dock workers have said, we're gonna strike too. So this is gonna close down the port. All the pressure is converging, and so there is an agreement. I wanted to mention Naomi. She had red hair and green eyes. She wore bell bottoms, and if you grabbed her, she would do something about it. And she formed a group she called Hell Angels, and they were the women who were standing at the doors and saying, I'm going to point at you, but I don't mean it, okay? Don't you come into work. You're not going past this door. Non-violently, of course, but you're not moving inside because you're one of my sisters and you're staying out here with us. She was an in-your-face, non-violently kind of woman. So what happens is they don't get a signed agreement, which means that they can't demand union dues. If you're a full union shop, then all employees have a union deduction, and it comes through a credit union. They get a credit union, they get a grievance procedure, they get their jobs back, but they don't get an official union that's being fed dues, and so after 4.5 years, the union is gone. But all of South Carolina's federal and state employees are finally moved into the present, and it's because these 400 women stood their ground for all those months. Aren't they wonderful? Yeah. Yeah, so let's go back to a picture of the groups of them. We're going to see some of those faces. There's that one. Let's look at that one. So what do you think of them? What do you think?
Great women.
Yeah. Very courageous. And they knew they were right. There's something powerful about absolutely being right, isn't there? Yeah. And they were not going to put up anymore with what they kept saying over again, being disrespected. That I don't think I have a picture of the sign, but a lot of the signs said human dignity, not even being given your name, being asked to do jobs that were illegal. There were white nursing students. They were supposed to train the nursing students, but if they offended a nursing student, that nursing student could fire them. So they were people who had put up with as much as they could put up, and then they went for nonviolent direct action to change things. Now, there was some violence in Charleston, but it wasn't coming from these people. There were people coming in. There were some, just a handful of firebombs. There was a small airport where a plane was caught on fire. There were people that were plants that they had to get out of town. There was a guy, I tried to track him down, but he wouldn't call me back, who was spying, and he was waving a gun around one day, and they just sort of got him to the floor, ushered him out. They knew who the FBI spy was and said, would you please take him out of the state? And so they did. So there were those kind of people infiltrating and trying to cause problems, but they were smart enough to figure out who that was. So I think it's interesting that the women said, we have the numbers, we have the personal power, but we need the strategists, and we want you coming in to support us because we need the strategies that only you know how to do that we don't know. And I think that did lead somewhat to their support. So let me ask you this. How many of you knew about the Charleston hospital strike? 1, 2, 3. Okay. Why don't we all know about the hospital strike? Why? Why don't we all know about this? It's a marvelous story, right? It's an inspiring story. Yeah.
Depends who was in charge of the newspaper and news.
White supremacist running the Post and Courier, named Waring. And they're the only statewide, so to speak, black newspaper was the Lighthouse and Informer, closed in 1954 because of a variety of issues. So anytime black newspapers were reporting on what was going on in South Carolina, they were coming from far away. They were coming the Philadelphia Courier, the Chicago Defender. They're having to come down, and they did, but they're having to send people in. Cecil is really the only one, he's writing and reporting and photographing for Jet, who is a black journalist located in the state who is sending things out. So there's a lock on the information. But I was listening on the way down to NPR, and a Native American was talking about, his language being lost, and his mother having been what was called a silent speaker. She was someone who had been trained in their native language, and then she was sent to one of these white boarding schools where they cut her hair, took away her clothes, changed her name, and punished her if she ever spoke her own language. So he talked about her as a silent speaker. And that stayed with me when I was thinking about talking to you about silent speech. And so one of the things that really motivated me to work on this book and to interview so many people was, as I was meeting Black elders, I was thinking several things. I was meeting people in their 70s and their 80s, or older, because this movement is beginning with Briggs versus Elliott in the 40s. And their stories are going to die with them, and we'll never know them. Why will their stories die with them? They're not in the newspapers. They're hardworking people who are not, they're not having a podcast, right? They're not maybe writing a letter to Life magazine. It's not going to publish it anyway. They're also not, many of them, not telling their children, because the people that were out there on the front lines who are going to push for the vote, they don't know if they're coming back alive that night. And they're not going to have their children worrying about that. So once I had interviewed James T. McCain several times, who went up and down, he was from Sumter, went up and down the East Coast teaching nonviolent direct action for the sit-ins, and beforehand he was working on voter rights. And after he passed on, his son said, I want to go to lunch with you, and I want you to talk to me about my father, because you know more about my father's stories than I do, because he was gone, and when he came home, he wanted to be a regular dad. He didn't want to talk about that. So I felt that these were such important stories, and that we don't know where we're going if we don't know where we've been. And we don't know in this state where we have been. And that is very dangerous for all of us. If we don't know our own stories, then that's dangerous. And so that's why I just kept interviewing people and interviewing people. And I was a good reporter. I loved what I did. From all that moving around, I had a wide open heart. I'm curious, and word got around. So I could go from one person to another person to another person, because they'd say, Claudia's okay. Or they'd say, Claudia, go talk to so-and-so. I'm going to tell him you're coming. So I just kept going and kept going and kept going to get these stories, which I think are very, very precious stories. And so how I'd like to wrap this up, and then I'm going to beg you for another question or two, I don't have any questions yet, is if you have stories, tell your children. Tell your children, because they need to know the truth. And you can tell them in a way that's not maybe as scary as what happened, but tell them so they can pass them on. We are, in some ways, our stories, aren't we? Yes. Yeah. So what kind of questions do you have for me? I'm going to be so sad if I leave without any questions. Oh, okay. Oh, your cousin.
So approximately how long did it take the union in Charleston for those women to get a union established?
So they were starting in '67, but 1199, the SCLC, are coming in 68, and it's taking 6 to 7 months to get to where we got to. So think about January to June for the hot action to be taking place.
And then, the other question is, and this is a personal question to you, in all of your interviewing, have your life ever been threatened as far as to get all of this information and publish it?
I had jerks call me when I was at the paper, yeah. But I wouldn't give them the time of day. So no, there were not any terrible threats, but I had ugly phone calls, sure. And I had some at home. I just would hang up the phone. Bullies want your attention. If you don't give them their attention, they may go bully somebody else. One of the interesting things that's happened as a response is I have a chapter in the book on Reverend James Hinton, who was the second president of the NAACP State Conference, and he served from 41 to 59. His family wanted to talk about him. I was talking about people not passing on their stories. So I had this great sort of family reunion. This was during COVID, so it was Zoom, where we talked about that. And Reverend Ivory, who was a leader in Rock Hill, whose daughter is still alive, she and I have bonded, and so we've arranged to have some events in Rock Hill for both family members and for the city to get them to know Reverend Ivory better. So there are those kinds of things where the word's getting out in a different way, just like this, This is through the Humanities Council, and I'm a member of the Speakers Bureau, so they're helping by, locating something like the library or this exhibit to pair me up with, for the stories.
I don't make a statement.
Uh-huh.
I went to AME Church,
Uh-huh.
and we have the Christian Recorder. The Christian Recorder has been going on for 200 years,
Uh-huh.
telling the story of
Yeah.
African American and community.
Yeah.
The second thing is that we had a pastor here, Pastor St. Paul AME Church. His name, I think it was G.E. Williams from Georgetown. I don't know, last name is William. You don't remember Reverend William? Anybody? He was the first. No, there was cousins, but I think G.E. Williams, he's originally from Georgetown.
Uh-huh.
I know some of his relatives still live there. He died several years ago. But when he became the pastor of St. Paul here, he had a newspaper also out.
Yeah.
Matter of fact, I got one copy of his newspaper, and all his family is still living. I know one is an AME pastor in another area.
Ooh, if any of his family has the
Yes.
newsletter, you should
I know
encourage
all
them to
of-
donate
all
to a
of his-
library or an
All his
archive.
sons-
Yeah.
All the kids go to Friendship AME Church in Columbia, where Andre is a musician.
Uh-huh.
I think you always ask the question, why not telling our story? And I read in the newspaper a couple of days ago with the Department of Education, they're gonna let the state decide what book they're gonna put in the library.
I know, it's terrible.
I think that's a very terrible thing, because one of the things I don't understand why so many white have problems with black writers and telling our story, because when you don't tell a full story,
Right.
and then if we don't write our story, they tell our story for us.
Yes, I agree.
I
I agree.
worked at the Rice Museum in Georgetown for a while, and I do tell a narrative, and so many white people get angry about the narrative you tell, because they got one version of African American slave history, but I lived that all my life. Genealogy, I done extensive genealogy, all this stuff, and I don't know why Americans, what's going on in Florida, they're trying to always narrate African American, because when you do that, when we look at the history of South Carolina, when you talk about all of the great people, all the people of Georgetown, all it was slave owners, huh?
Yes,
The
yes.
last one was slave owners. We said, well, they were the church, even the preachers and everybody was slave owners. Why we can't continue telling our story? Because they think we don't have a story to tell. We do have a story to tell.
The Post and Courier, which I mentioned was a segregationist, white supremacist paper, it did a whole series in which it compared McCord to Robert E. Lee and talked about the strikers as the black spear, in other words, making it tribal, and what else? I don't, just some, it's as a journalist who really was trying to do good, it was horrifying to look at those white newspapers and how they weren't covering black life. They weren't interviewing the women strikers. That's the story, isn't it? It's the women who are on the street striking. They didn't interview them. They interviewed McCord. So there's that horrible kind of thing. There's also, I think, I have seen a chip on the shoulder of people who want to think they're good. Okay, they're not doing anything, but they want to think they're good. And I had a friend, I was talking to her about Sumter, where she had been. Sumter was a really tough city. The White Citizens Council would publish stuff on the front page. And I was asking her about some things, because she was of an age where she could have seen certain things. And she was like, no, never saw any of that. And so I asked her, well, did you have a black housekeeper? And she said yes. And I said, did you ever ride with your mom to take your black housekeeper home? She said yes. I said, did they have paved streets? No. Were there city lights? No. I just went through this list. And I said, did you think about that? You know? But part of that is, again, you want to think you're a good person, you know, you're tithing at church or something, but also there's this. And being a military brat was not always easy. I'm moving around a lot, you know, everybody's disappearing on me every 2 years. I got to make a new set of friends. But it really pulls those blinders back, you know, where you were looking at people and saying, we all want love. We all want to avoid suffering. You know, we can help each other with that. What's going on here? You know?
I've traveled to 32, I've been in the military for 30 years.
Uh-huh.
I have traveled to 32 different countries. And every country treat people of color the same way, or worse. I went to every country and every last one, and always tell a white story. They don't tell a story about the people of color.
Well, do you think race is real? I know this is kind of a crazy question, but 99.9% of our DNA is exactly the same. So is race a cultural construct, or is race real? I mean, you're living it as real, right? I mean, in terms of how your life is, but is it really real?
Yes.
As a social construct, as a cultural construct, as anything else? Is there any other way that it's real? I think that's something to think about. Okay, religious, church?
Well, religion.
Yeah. I think it's something really interesting. There's Nell Painter, who is a historian and now has followed her name and become an artist, a painter. She has a book that's called something like, I think it's called White People, and it was a course she would teach. And it's about how white became white. Because it's all made up. So there were all these scholars. I'm going to just really desecrate her text, but there are all these scholars coming to Germany, and they're looking at skulls, and they're trying to say, oh, this skull's bigger and better than that skull, you know, and they're mistaking the white Roman statues for an admiration of whiteness when they were just copying the Greek statues, which were painted, and Greek people are not milky white, right? They're making all these mistakes along the way, but they're making it scholarly and making it as if it were true. And so what she tracks in this book is the way we went from, oh, they're the people who live in the marsh, or they're the people who live on the mountain, to they're Italy, or they're France, or they're a color. And how bogus all this is. It's a really interesting book. She is African American, by the way.
What's the name of that book?
I'm not going to get it exactly right. What is it?
I'm trying to get it.
Oh, Nell Painter.
What is it? What's the title?
The author is Nell Painter, and I think it's something like just white people. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Frank's looking it up back there? Yeah. Uh-huh.
Yes, it's amazing, your presentation, I thought was good.
Oh, thank you.
The same fight is going on today because I think it was in California, it was Kaiser, the medical people went on strike, protest for better pay.
Uh-huh.
And this is over 50
Yeah,
years.
Starbucks, you know, there are several places that are trying. Huh?
History of white people.
History of white people, yeah. We should,
It also seems as if though history is repeating itself. It seems as if though the things, this is,
familiar, isn't it?
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
and when I look at this, it seems as if though this was yesterday
Yeah,
because it's still happening.
yeah. And
And so I guess a question that, how long does it take a group of people to just want to be treated equally?
Yeah.
How long will it take? It does not take your history and disregard it. All we want is our history to be told accurately.
yeah,
Right.
So why is it that white people do not want Black history to be taught accurately?
correct, that's right.
back to the question, how long? How
Yeah.
many generations will people have to fight continuously for the same thing that
These women were, yeah.
Yeah.
for so long?
I think, to me, until we start looking at people as human beings.
Yeah, which is what they wanted.
Israel,
Yeah.
Gaza today
Yeah,
is racial things like that. It's not only, ethnic groups and all of that, but it's a racial thing. Until we start looking at people, as human, we'd never get beyond. Someone said, one of the theologians said, we'd never get beyond the color line. Because we don't see people as people.
I do have some hope with young people. When I was at Columbia College from 2006 to 2016, so it's been a while. But I didn't, it was a women's college, but I didn't see those young women being worried about race or gender identification. I mean, there were exceptions, but there was a real equality going on there and a real support. And it was a very small college where people really got to know each other. But that gave me some hope. My own children give me some hope, that people who are trying and who are trying, I like the word awake, who are trying to be awake and notice, and then speak up, be brave enough to speak up. And that can be really scary, but it's the right thing to do, right? And I felt that the young women that I was working with were working hard at that, but also some of it was very natural to them, maybe because of their school experiences had been more positive. The other thing is going back, I know it's oversimplifying, but people wanting to think they are good people or their great-great-great-grandparents were. That bizarre statement about, oh, well, my granddaddy was a good master, or something like that. Where does that come from? You're owning a human being, and you say, oh, they were good, So that's about, sort of a crouching down into wanting to believe something that's really kind of impossible to believe. And it's a sickness. It's a sickness that keeps you stuck. And I think it's worthwhile to politely say, what are you talking about? Yeah.
My last thing, when I listened to my cousin's story and what you told, they put my mind to Georgetown. No different. I remember as a little boy, we drive out and I became here. And my first time I ever participated in the march, I was a little boy, the steel plant march. And when we walked downtown, that gun everywhere on the top of the building. I mean, you make one move, and you have marksmen everywhere. I remember that.
Yeah, well, think about that picture of the governor. One of the things that I kept thinking, and I know we're running out of time here, but one of the things that I kept thinking about, oops, I've gone. And I saw this in the newspapers all the time. Those are South Carolina citizens they're pointing the gun at, right? So, what is happening there, when you talk about that cliche it is, but of othering, these are South Carolinians. This is a mom with her kid. This is a teenager. This is a priest. And you're standing there with those guns, pointing at essentially what are your people you share citizenship with, if not a neighborhood or a school.
I think there's, like she say, how long, does this have to go on? I think it goes back to, like you say, back to the slavery days, the ancestors, and it's just a mind thing that they feel like they're powerful, they're greater or whatever. But then you have some younger generations now that look back at their ancestors and they feel like that was wrong, it shouldn't have gone on, because like you say, with you teaching college, and now college children, they're living together, they're socializing together, different races and cultures and all that. So my son attended Winthrop, and he attached to this white guy from his freshman year. He graduated 2018, and they're still like this.
Best friends,
And they talk about their culture and their race to each other like they're truly blood brothers. Because he said, I feel like that was wrong. I don't know why my ancestors had to do this. So they have an open, conversation about their culture and where it came from and how it was done. So you do have a few younger generations, that feel like it was wrong, but they have no control over that. But like I say, it goes back to that, ancestor slavery days, and some of them still uphold that. So, you have some young people who may want to follow on tradition, but you never know when the line is going to be broken. That's just a mind thing.
It's up to that child.
Yeah, it's up to that child.
To that person.
Right.
Each individual.
Right.
To, decide, do I want to keep the old family ways, or do I want to break this generational, this thing and move forward, like you say, and take action, and be responsible for, what you do and put out into the world.
Yeah.
It starts with each person, I think.
Well, I do think education's pivotal. I mean, because it makes you think, but also if you're sharing a school, this was my own experience with my parents. Your parents say something stupid and racist, but you're in class with the people they're saying stupid racist things about, and that's not true.
Right.
Boy, my mom just, I was 5 years old and she was off the pedestal, So experience, personal experience, and that coming through things like sharing a classroom and a sports team or choir, sharing all those things and making friends. Uh-huh.
It is very important that you talk about it. Not to be afraid to talk about it. With your white sisters and brothers, you need to be able to ask questions. If it's something that you don't understand about, a black person, ask the question. Talk about it.
Yeah.
And
And there's a way to ask that question,
absolutely,
Right.
with respect.
Right.
And the other thing that I wanted to say about this presentation, which was excellent, I enjoyed it.
Oh, thank you.
Women. Women has always been the back. Women will get the job done.
We got two guys smiling here.
Strong mama.
I know I'm still hesitant to even say that, but it is true, even back in the biblical days, the women would get the work done, and they had to pass it on to the men to present it to the church.
Exactly.
Juanita Abernathy came to USC during a women's studies event many, many, many decades ago. And she was talking about how her husband was on Life magazine cover. She was at home with the bomb planted under the house. She said, so don't tell me I wasn't working in the movement, And she said that he would show up with 10 people that were expecting to sleep on the floor and be fed by her while she mimeographed. Remember mimeograph machines? While she mimeographed the statement. So she said, I may not have been on the cover of Life magazine, but I was working in the movement, So I have a problem with what I think of as the great man history. Now, I'm a journalist, I'm not a historian, but I do think there's a mistake in thinking that history comes from Winston Churchill or whoever, you know my point there, yeah. Well, I'm going to applaud you. It was a great conversation. Thank you very much.
Well, and we should definitely applaud Claudia for all her work in this book, which is wonderful, and it is for sale. You can take a piece of it home with you and read the rest of these stories. So it really is a wonderful commitment to what is through this presentation and this conversation, wonderful conversation afterwards. It is a crucial story, not just to South Carolina's past, but our future. So thank y'all for being here. And once again, let's thank Claudia Smith Brinson.